I still remember the look on Sergeant Klaus Weber's face when he realized what was about to happen. It was a mixture of disbelief, terror, and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe respect. Maybe the dawning understanding that everything he thought he knew about modern warfare was about to change forever. My name is Captain David Reeves, and I served as a forward observer with the United States Army during the final phases of World War II in Europe. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how American artillery revolutionized combat and how I witnessed firsthand the moment when the German military machine finally understood it had been outmatched by technology they couldn't even comprehend. It was March 1945, and our unit was pushing through the Rhineland deep into German territory. The war was winding down, but nobody had told the Wehrmacht that. They were fighting with a desperation born of knowing they'd already lost, which made them more dangerous than ever. I'd been in Europe since D-Day +30, landing on Omaha Beach after the initial assault had secured a foothold. I'd seen combat across France, survived the Battle of the Bulge and crossed into Germany with the rest of the Third Army, but nothing in my training or experience had prepared me for what happened during those final weeks of the war. Our battalion was tasked with clearing a series of small towns along the Rhine River. Intelligence reported that the Germans had established strong defensive positions in these towns, using the buildings and narrow streets to negate our armor advantage. They'd learned from years of fighting that American forces relied heavily on tanks and artillery, so they'd adapted their tactics accordingly. What they didn't know was that we'd adapted too. I was assigned to a forward observer team, which meant my job was to locate enemy positions and call in artillery strikes. It sounds simple enough, but in reality, it was one of the most dangerous jobs in the infantry. We had to get close enough to the enemy to accurately identify their positions, close enough that we could hear them talking, close enough that one wrong move would get us killed. My team consisted of 4 men: myself, Corporal Jimmy Patterson from Alabama, Private First Class Carlos Martinez from Texas, and our radio operator, Private Eddie Walsh from Brooklyn. The morning we arrived outside the town of Kreuzberg, the fog was so thick you could barely see 20 feet in any direction. It was cold, damp, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones and stays there. We'd been moving since before dawn, trying to get into position before the sun burned off the fog. The town sat in a valley, surrounded by low hills covered in bare trees. From our vantage point on the eastern hill, we could see the church steeple poking through the fog like a skeletal finger pointing at the sky. "Sir, I don't like this," Patterson whispered. He was lying next to me, peering through his binoculars. "Too quiet." "They know we're coming." He was right. The town was silent, no movement, no signs of life. But intelligence had confirmed that at least 2 companies of German infantry were dug in there, along with several anti-tank positions. They were waiting for us to make the first move. "Eddie, check the radio," I said. "Make sure we've got clear communication with the fire direction center." Walsh adjusted his equipment, speaking quietly into the handset. "Lima Charlie, sir. 5x5. Artillery is standing by." This was the moment when I first got to demonstrate what made American artillery different from anything the Germans had ever faced. While the Wehrmacht had excellent guns and skilled crews, they relied on centralized fire control that was slow and inflexible. Each battery operated somewhat independently, and coordinating fire between multiple batteries took time. But we'd developed something revolutionary: the Fire Direction Center system. The FDC wasn't just a radio room. It was a nerve center that could coordinate fire from dozens of batteries simultaneously, calculate firing solutions in seconds rather than minutes, and deliver devastating concentrations of firepower with unprecedented accuracy, and we'd refined it to an art form. The system used something called a map-spotted observer technique, combined with rapid calculation methods that let us call for fire and have shells landing on target in under a minute. "Patterson, Martinez, mark these coordinates," I said, reading off the map references for several key positions in the town. The church, what looked like a command post in the town hall, a barn on the northern edge that would make an excellent strong point, and several houses along the main street. My team recorded everything meticulously. At 0800 hours, our company commander gave the order to probe the German defenses. A platoon of infantry moved down the hill toward the town, supported by 2 Sherman tanks. They made it maybe 200 yards before all hell broke loose. German machine guns opened up from concealed positions, their distinctive rapid-fire sound echoing across the valley. The infantry went to ground, and the Shermans began firing their main guns at the muzzle flashes. "Time to go to work," I said. I grabbed the radio handset from Walsh. Fire Direction Center. This is Observer 2-3. Fire Mission. Grid reference 4272895. Infantry and buildings. Request high explosive variable time fuse. 6 batteries. Time on target. There was a brief pause, then the response. Observer 2-3, roger. 6 batteries. HEVT. Time on target. Stand by for shot. What happened next was the magic that made American artillery unstoppable. The Fire Direction Center was coordinating fire from 6 different artillery batteries, each consisting of 4 to 6 guns, positioned miles behind our lines. They were calculating different firing solutions for each battery based on their position, the wind, the temperature, the rotation of the earth. Each battery would fire at slightly different times so that all the shells would arrive on target simultaneously. Shot over, came the call from the FDC. Shot out, I replied, checking my watch. 37 seconds from my request to shells in the air. The Germans would have needed at least 5 minutes to accomplish the same thing. Splash over, the FDC called, warning us that impact was imminent. Splash out. I put my binoculars to my eyes and watched the town. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire northern section of Kreuzberg simply disappeared in a wall of fire and smoke. The sound reached us a split second later, a rolling thunder that shook the ground beneath us. The shells were equipped with variable time fuses, meaning they exploded in the air above the targets, raining shrapnel down on anyone caught in the open. Jesus Christ, Martinez whispered. In all my months of combat, I'd never seen anything quite like it. 24 to 36 heavy artillery shells, all landing within seconds of each other, all concentrated on a grid square maybe 200 yards on each side. It was like watching God's hammer come down from heaven. Adjust fire. Left 100. Add 50. I called into the radio. Same target. 3 batteries. Fire for effect. This time it took only 20 seconds. The FDC had already calculated the firing solution. They just needed to adjust for my correction. Another dozen shells obliterated the center of town. Through my binoculars, I could see buildings collapsing, dust and debris filling the air. And still the German machine guns kept firing. These were tough, experienced soldiers. They'd survived years of war on the Eastern Front, where the Soviets had thrown everything at them. They weren't going to break easily, but they'd never experienced anything like American artillery operating at full efficiency. We could deliver more firepower, more accurately and more quickly than any army in history, and we were about to prove it. Eddie, get me battalion fire support, I said. I want everything they've got. What I was about to call in was known as a serenade, and it was the ultimate demonstration of American firepower. Instead of just my assigned batteries, I was requesting every available artillery piece in range, from light 105mm howitzers to heavy 105mm guns, to the massive 8-inch howitzers that could throw a 200-pound shell over 10 miles. All coordinated, all timed to hit simultaneously. The approval came through from battalion. They understood what I was trying to do. We weren't just trying to neutralize the German positions. We were trying to break their will to fight. We were trying to make them understand that resistance was futile. All batteries fire mission. Grid reference 4 to 7 to 2, 8 to 9 5. Danger close. Infantry and fortified positions. Request Chi, Willie Pete, and VT. Maximum effect. Time on target in 5 minutes. Willie Pete was white phosphorus, which burned at over 5,000 degrees and created a smoke screen that would blind the German observers. Combined with high explosive and variable time fuses, it would turn the entire town into an inferno. The 5-minute delay gave our infantry time to pull back to safe positions. I watched the seconds tick by on my watch. The German fire had slackened somewhat, but they were still fighting. Through my binoculars, I could see movement in the town, soldiers running between buildings, trying to reinforce their positions. They had no idea what was coming. At exactly EU 827 hours, the world ended for the German defenders of Kreuzberg. The first shells arrived exactly on time, a testament to the skill and precision of the American artillery crews. But these weren't just a few dozen shells. This was every gun within range, firing as fast as they could load. For 3 solid minutes, high explosive shells rained down on that town at a rate of over 100 per minute. I'd called artillery strikes before, big ones, but nothing like this. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous roar that drowned out all other noise. The ground shook constantly, like an earthquake that wouldn't stop. Through my binoculars, I watched as entire buildings simply ceased to exist. The church steeple, which had been our primary landmark, toppled like a cut tree, and disappeared into the smoke. White phosphorus shells created pillars of fire that rose hundreds of feet into the air. The variable time fuses turned the air itself into a killing zone. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost painful. My ears were ringing, and I could see my team members looking dazed, shaking their heads. Slowly, the smoke and dust began to clear, carried away by the morning breeze. Where the town of Kreuzberg had stood, there was now mostly rubble. A few walls still stood, but most of the buildings had been reduced to piles of broken stone and splintered timber. Small fires burned throughout the ruins, and the white phosphorus had created a haze that hung over everything like a funeral shroud. "Check fire! Check fire!" I called into the radio. "Assessing damage." We waited for 10 minutes, watching for any signs of German resistance. Nothing. No machine gun fire, no movement, nothing. The town was dead. Our infantry moved forward cautiously, expecting booby traps or holdouts. What they found instead were German soldiers emerging from cellars and basements with their hands up, many of them without weapons, some without their uniforms. They were covered in dust and blood, their eyes wide with shock. These were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who'd survived Stalingrad and Kursk, and they'd been broken by 15 minutes of American artillery. That's when we captured Sergeant Klaus Weber. He was a squad leader, 32 years old, with a wife and 2 children back in Hamburg. He spoke passable English, which he'd learned before the war when he'd worked as a merchant sailor. As our MPs were processing the prisoners, I approached him. I wanted to understand what they'd experienced down there. "What was it like?" I asked him. Weber looked at me with those hollow eyes, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he started talking, his voice flat, emotionless. "We've fought the Russians for 3 years. We've been bombed by British Lancaster bombers. We've faced Soviet artillery barrages that lasted for hours. But this was different. We couldn't hear it coming. We couldn't predict where it would hit. It was everywhere at once. One moment Schmidt was next to me, and the next moment there was just nothing. The building we were in, it was solid stone, 2 feet thick. It didn't matter. The shells found us anyway." He paused, looking back at the ruins of his defensive position. "We thought we could hold until nightfall, then withdraw. That was the plan. Hold the Americans for 1 day, make them pay for every meter. We had good positions, good fields of fire. We'd stopped your tanks before. But then the shelling started and it never stopped. How do you fight that? How do you fight when the entire world is trying to kill you?" "We call it fire for effect," I said quietly. Weber laughed, a bitter sound. "Effect. Yes, very effective. We had 83 men in this town this morning. Now I think maybe 20 are alive and half of those are wounded. You erased us. You erased the entire town. How do you have so many guns? How do you coordinate them so quickly? Our artillery, it takes time to set up, time to calculate, time to communicate. But yours, it's like you just point at a map and say, 'Destroy this,' and it's gone." I didn't tell him about the Fire Direction Center, about the plotting boards and the mathematical tables, and the radio networks that made it all possible. I didn't tell him that what he'd just experienced was actually a relatively small barrage by our standards. During the Battle of the Bulge, we delivered fire missions that were 10 times larger. I just nodded and let the MPs take him away. The rest of the day was spent clearing the town and preparing for the next advance. As forward observers, my team had a rare few hours to rest before we'd be needed again. We sat on the hillside eating cold rations and drinking coffee that tasted like mud. None of us talked much. We were all thinking about what we'd just witnessed. Patterson finally broke the silence. "Sir, do you think the Germans knew? I mean, before today, did they understand what they were up against?" I thought about Weber's face, about his description of the barrage. "I don't think they could have known, not really. You can read reports, you can hear stories, but until you experience it yourself, you can't understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of that much firepower delivered that quickly." "How many shells do you think we fired?" Martinez asked. I'd been doing the math in my head. 6 batteries firing for 3 minutes, each gun capable of firing 3 to 4 rounds per minute. "Somewhere between 400 and 500 shells, give or take, maybe more." Walsh let out a low whistle. "And we can do that every day? Multiple times a day? As long as the ammunition holds out," I confirmed. "And we've got plenty of ammunition. That's one of the advantages of having the entire American industrial machine behind us. The Germans can't match our production, and they definitely can't match our logistics." What I didn't say, what I was only beginning to understand myself, was that we'd fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. For thousands of years, Artillery had been a slow, methodical affair. You'd set up your guns, you'd calculate your shots, you'd fire, you'd adjust, you'd fire again. It was more art than science, and it took time. But American artillery had turned it into a science, a precise, devastating science that could deliver overwhelming firepower with minimal delay. The Germans had relied on their tactical superiority, their experienced soldiers, their defensive positions. They'd learned to dig in, to create strong points, to make us pay for every advance. But none of that mattered when we could simply erase their positions from existence in minutes. It wasn't fair, it wasn't sporting. But war isn't about being fair. It's about winning, and we'd found a way to win that the Germans couldn't counter. Over the next few weeks, we continued our advance into Germany. Each time we encountered resistance, the pattern repeated. I'd call in fire, the FDC would coordinate the batteries, and the target would cease to exist. Sometimes the Germans would surrender before the barrage even ended. Other times, like at Kreuzberg, they'd fight through it, only to emerge broken and beaten. I remember one particular incident about a week later. We'd cornered a German unit in a small village, maybe a company-sized element. They'd fortified the place well, turned it into a miniature fortress. Our company commander wanted to assault it directly, but I convinced him to let me try the artillery first. "How long will it take?" he asked. "Give me 10 minutes, I replied. He looked skeptical, but he agreed. I called in the fire mission specifying which buildings to hit, which streets to block, where to lay down smoke. The FDC did its job perfectly. 9 minutes later, the village was in ruins, and white flags were appearing from the rubble. We'd neutralized a fortified company without losing a single American soldier. That's when I really understood the strategic implications of what we'd developed. It wasn't just about firepower. It was about efficiency, about minimizing our own casualties while maximizing the enemy's losses. Every time we used artillery instead of infantry assaults, we saved American lives, and the Germans, veterans of brutal combat on the Eastern Front, had no answer for it. One night, I was sitting with a group of infantry officers, discussing the day's operations. A captain named Jenkins, who'd been fighting since North Africa, made an observation that stuck with me. You know what the Germans' biggest mistake was? They thought warfare was about soldiers, about tactics, about having the best tanks or the toughest infantry. But they were wrong. Modern warfare is about systems, about logistics, about coordination. They had brave soldiers and good equipment, but they didn't have the systems to use them effectively. We do. He was right. The German military was built on the idea of individual excellence, of small units operating independently, of tactical flexibility at the lowest levels. The American military was built on standardization, on systems, on coordination. Neither approach was inherently better, but when it came to artillery, our systematic approach was overwhelmingly superior. The Fire Direction Center wasn't just a technical innovation, it was a philosophical one. It treated artillery as a centralized resource that could be allocated dynamically based on need. Instead of each battery commander deciding where to shoot, a central authority coordinated all available firepower to achieve maximum effect. It was democracy applied to warfare, pooling resources for the common good rather than relying on individual initiative. By April, as we pushed deeper into Germany, the Wehrmacht was collapsing. Part of it was the Soviet advance from the east, part of it was exhaustion and supply shortages, but part of it was the dawning realization that they couldn't win, and our artillery played no small role in that realization. Every time they tried to establish a defensive line, we'd blast it apart. Every time they tried to hold a town, we'd reduce it to rubble. They couldn't hide. They couldn't dig in deep enough. They couldn't protect themselves. I encountered Klaus Weber one more time before the war ended. He was in a POW camp near the Rhine, waiting to be processed. I'd brought some supplies for the prisoners, cigarettes and coffee, small comforts. When he saw me, he recognized me immediately. "The artillery officer," he said. "From Kreuzberg." "That's right, how are you holding up?" He shrugged. "I'm alive. That's more than I can say for most of my unit. The war is over for me, and I'm glad. I can go home to my family. If Hamburg is still standing." We talked for a while about the war, about our families, about what would happen next. Eventually, I asked him what he'd learned from his experience at Kreuzberg. Weber thought for a long moment before answering. "I learned that courage doesn't matter against overwhelming force. I learned that experience and training can only take you so far. But mostly, I learned that we never really understood what we were fighting against. We thought we were fighting the Americans, the British, the Russians, But we were really fighting against industrial capacity, against technology, against systems we couldn't match. Your artillery, it wasn't just better than ours. It was a different kind of weapon entirely. It was like we brought swords to a gunfight. He paused, looking at the barbed wire surrounding the camp. Do you know what we called it? Your artillery. Unsicked bear artillery. Invisible artillery. Because we couldn't see it, couldn't predict it, couldn't defend against it. We'd hear the radio call and seconds later the shells would arrive. No warning, no time to take cover. Just sudden, overwhelming destruction. Grid squares would vanish. Entire companies would cease to exist. How do you fight that? You can't. You can only hope to survive it. That conversation stayed with me long after the war ended. Invisible artillery. It was a perfect description. The Germans could see our tanks, could see our infantry, could prepare for our air attacks, but our artillery was invisible until it was too late. By the time they heard the shells coming, they were already dead. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. I was there when the German commanders signed the surrender documents, when the fighting finally stopped. It was a strange feeling, anticlimactic in a way. For months, we'd been advancing, fighting, calling in fire missions, and then suddenly it was over. The guns fell silent, and an entire continent tried to figure out what came next. I stayed in Germany for 6 months after the surrender, helping with occupation duties and training. During that time, I met with several former German artillery officers who'd been captured. They were fascinated by our fire direction system, wanted to understand how it worked. I gave them the basics, nothing classified, just the general principles. They were stunned. One former major, a man named Hoffman who'd commanded an artillery battalion, shook his head in disbelief. We had talented crews, good guns, excellent training, but we were fighting with 19th century methods against 20th century technology. Each of our batteries operated independently. We had to communicate by radio or telephone, calculate firing solutions manually, coordinate between units through a chain of command. It took time, sometimes too much time. He pulled out a notebook and showed me calculations. A single fire mission for my battalion would take anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes from request to impact, and that was if everything went well, if communications were good, if we didn't need to relocate, but you with your fire direction center could do it in under a minute, and you could coordinate dozens of batteries simultaneously. We couldn't compete with that. I asked him what the psychological effect had been on German troops, knowing that American artillery could strike anywhere, anytime, with overwhelming force. Hoffman's expression darkened. It was devastating to morale. Soldiers can accept combat, can accept danger when they feel they have a chance to fight back. But your artillery, it was different. There was no fighting back, no chance to evade, no warning. Men would be talking one moment, and the next moment they'd be gone, obliterated by shells they never heard coming. Units that had fought for years on the Eastern Front, that had survived the worst the Soviets could throw at them, would break after experiencing American artillery. They'd refuse to advance, would desert their positions, would surrender rather than face another barrage. Grid squares would vanish, as you say, and with them, the will to fight. When I finally came home to the United States in late 1945, I was a different person than the young officer who'd landed in Normandy 18 months earlier. I'd seen things I'd never forget, done things I never thought I'd do, but mostly, I'd witnessed a revolution in warfare, and I'd been privileged to play a small part in it. The fire direction center system we'd developed during World War II became the foundation for modern artillery doctrine. Today's artillery is even more precise, even faster, using computers and GPS and smart munitions. But the basic principle remains the same: centralized coordination of firepower to achieve maximum effect. We proved in 1945 that systematic, coordinated artillery could change the course of battles, could save lives, could win wars. I think about Klaus Weber sometimes, about our conversations in those ruined German towns. He understood, perhaps better than I did at the time, what had really happened. The Germans hadn't just lost a war, they'd been outmatched by a system they couldn't replicate, by an approach to warfare that their military culture couldn't accommodate. They'd brought their experience, their courage, their tactical excellence to the battlefield, and we'd responded with mathematics, coordination, and overwhelming firepower. Invisible artillery, grid squares vanishing in minutes, an entire military rendered obsolete by American innovation and industrial might. That was the story of American artillery in World War II, and I was there to see it unfold. The Germans couldn't believe it until they experienced it firsthand, until they sat in their bunkers and felt the earth shake, until they emerged from the rubble and realized their entire unit had been erased from existence. War is hell, they say, and that's true. But war is also about adaptation, about innovation, about finding ways to achieve your objectives while minimizing your own casualties. American artillery did that better than any weapon system before or since, and the Germans, for all their skill and courage, never found an answer to it. I'm an old man now, living in a quiet town in Pennsylvania, far from the battlefields of Europe. But I still have my old maps, my fire direction tables, my notebooks filled with grid coordinates and fire missions. Sometimes I take them out and remember those days when I was young and the fate of nations hung in the balance. I remember the sound of shells raining down on distant targets, the crackling of the radio as the FDC confirmed fire missions, the sight of entire grid squares disappearing in clouds of smoke and fire. And I remember Klaus Weber's face, the hollow look in his eyes, the dawning realization that he'd been fighting a battle he could never win. Germans couldn't believe America's invisible artillery, not until it was too late, not until entire grid squares vanished in minutes, and they understood that modern warfare had left them behind. That's the legacy of American artillery in World War II, and it's a legacy I'm proud to have been part of, even as I recognize the terrible cost of war on both sides.